About the protest movement.
Yes, they are.
But they were so flippant that they were singing a happy-go-lucky song, which happens to be one I wrote. And I'm glad they sang it. And when I get there, I'll sing it with them. When I get in.
John Lennon and Paul McCartney. It was a songwriting partnership that didn't just write hits. It changed the world. They weren't just a duo. They were brothers, the twin hearts of the Beatles, connected by raw talent and a tragic loss they both shared. Their creative genius was born from a friendship so deep it felt totally unbreakable. But behind all the music and the adoration, a bitter rivalry was taking root. It was a conflict that would eventually tear the world's biggest band apart and explode into a public war of words. It was a feud captured in a song so vicious, so personal, it was a direct shot at the very soul of their bond. This is the story of how the greatest creative partnership in music history curdled into a spectacle of public anger, and how a brotherhood, shattered by fame, tried to find its way back. Before they were icons, they were just a couple of boys from Liverpool. John was the sharp-witted, rebellious rocker, and Paul was the charming, melodic prodigy. When they met in 1957, it was a spark that lit a creative fire. But what really cemented their bond was a shared grief few could ever understand. Paul lost his mother, Mary, to cancer when he was just 14. Only a year later, John's mother, Julia, was tragically killed in a car accident. That shared trauma forged a profound, unspoken connection between them. They were two boys who had lost their anchors, and they found a creative and emotional lifeboat in each other. In the early days of the Beatles, this bond was their superpower. It was Lennon and McCartney against the world. Their songwriting was like a magical conversation, an almost telepathic exchange of ideas where one's weakness was the other's strength. John's raw, cynical edge was perfectly softened by Paul's optimistic melodies. Paul's polished songcraft got a jolt of unpredictable energy from John's experimental instincts. They were competitive, sure, but it was the kind of competition that pushed them both to be better, to reach higher. They were writing the soundtrack for a generation, and at the heart of it all, they were two best friends living out an impossible dream. But as the dream got bigger, the cracks started to show. The first major blow to the Beatles' unity, and to John and Paul's relationship, was the death of their manager, Brian Epstein, in 1967. Epstein had been their guide, their negotiator, and pretty often, their peacekeeper. In the power vacuum he left behind, Paul stepped up, trying to steer the ship. But what Paul saw as leadership, John saw as being controlling and bossy. John, who was getting more and more into experimental art and his new relationship with Yoko Ono, started to resent Paul's more mainstream, detail-oriented approach to their work. The recording sessions for the White Album and Let It Be turned into battlegrounds. Where there was once an easy collaboration, now there was tension and constant arguments. George Harrison felt overlooked, and Ringo Starr even quit the band for a bit. John was pulling away, building a new identity with Yoko, and he saw Paul's efforts to keep the band together as a threat to his own freedom. That easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by sarcastic jabs and quiet resentment. The brotherhood was fracturing under the massive pressure of its own creation, and the business of being the Beatles was about to turn their private feud into a very public war. The Beatles officially broke up in 1970, but the fight was really just getting started. Lawsuits started flying, and the arguments over money and control got nasty. It was in their solo music, though, that the feud erupted for the whole world to see. Paul fired the first shot. On his 1971 album, Ram, the song Too Many People had lyrics that John instantly took as personal attacks. Paul sang of too many people preaching practices, a clear jab at John and Yoko's public peace campaigns. Then came the killer line, "You took your lucky break and broke it in two." Paul later admitted that an earlier version of the lyric was even more blunt. "Yoko took your lucky break and broke it in two." To John, this was a massive betrayal. He felt like Paul was smugly judging his life and his love. And John, who was never one to turn the other cheek, decided he was going to hit back with everything he had. He didn't just want to answer Paul, he wanted to destroy him. Paul had thrown a rock. John was about to drop a bomb. This musical feud became one of the most infamous in rock history, a brutal public airing of grievances between two men who were once like brothers. But was John's response justified, or was it a cruel overreaction? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you're finding this deep dive into the story behind the music compelling, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. John's response was the song How Do You Sleep from his 1971 album Imagine. This wasn't just a song, it was a character assassination set to music. Every single line was a carefully crafted dart aimed right at Paul McCartney's heart and his legacy. The song opens with a jab at Paul's perceived role on the band's most famous album. So Sgt. Pepper took you by surprise, before sneering, "Those freaks was right when they said you was dead." A cruel dig referencing the Paul is dead conspiracy theory. Then came the most brutal attacks, aimed at Paul's music. "The only thing you done was yesterday," John sang, dismissing his CEO partner's entire body of work in one single contemptuous line. He followed it by mocking Paul's recent solo single, "And since you've gone, you're just another day." He called Paul's music "Muzak to my ears," and venomously dismissed his entire social circle. To make the betrayal sting even more, John brought in their former bandmate George Harrison to play the scorching slide guitar on the track. The song was a sensation. It was raw, shocking, and incredibly personal. John had taken their private fight and broadcast it to the world in the most vicious way possible. He had weaponized his genius against his oldest friend, and for a while, it really seemed like there was no coming back from it. The fallout was huge. The press loved the drama, but fans were heartbroken to see their heroes tearing each other apart so publicly. In the years that followed, John would sometimes try to downplay the song's venom, claiming it was really about himself and his own insecurities. But the damage was done. Paul was deeply hurt. He said in his book, The Lyrics, that it felt like John was firing missiles at me, and he couldn't figure out why his friend wanted to punch him in the face so publicly. Yet, as time went on, the wounds began to heal. The intense anger started to fade. By the mid-1970s, the public attacks had stopped and were replaced by private phone calls. Paul and his wife Linda would sometimes visit John at his New York apartment in the Dakota building. There are even bootleg recordings from a 1974 jam session in LA, proving they did play music together again, even if it was just informally. During one famous visit in 1976, they were watching Saturday Night Live when producer Lorne Michaels came on screen and jokingly offered the Beatles $3,000 to reunite on the show. They actually considered going down to the studio for a laugh, but decided they were too tired. It was a little glimpse of the easy friendship they once had. They never formally collaborated again, but they found their way back to a kind of normalcy. They talked about baking bread and raising kids. The bitterness had finally given way to the quiet comfort of a shared history. The relationship between John Lennon and Paul McCartney was a complex mix of love, loyalty, jealousy, and anger. They were brothers, creatively and emotionally, and, like a lot of brothers, they fought with a passion that could only come from that deep of a connection. The feud that spawned How Do You Sleep was the ugliest chapter in their story, a painful and public display of a bond breaking under unimaginable strain. But it wasn't the final chapter. They found their way back to each other, not as the global icons Lennon and McCartney, but just as John and Paul. The reconciliation, though private and never fully complete, was real. Paul has often said how incredibly glad he was that they repaired their friendship before John's tragic death in 1980. To have been left with that animosity, he said, would have been the worst thing in the world. The story of John and Paul is a powerful reminder that even the deepest bonds can be fractured, but the connection that forged them in the first place never truly disappears. It just waits for a chance to be remembered.